The 2011 Tōhoku earthquake and tsunami. The earth tore open at 2:46 p.m., and Japan shifted on its axis. Entire cities slid toward the sea. A coastline centuries old was erased in less than 6 minutes. What if it happened again tomorrow? Waves taller than towers exploded inland, swallowing airports, highways, temples, schools. Concrete shattered like glass. The Pacific sea floor wrenched upward, rewriting maps drawn by satellites only hours before. Honshu itself, the heart of Japan, lurched eastward by meters. Imagine what it would mean for a nation to wake up displaced, its very foundation stolen by the deep. Sirens screamed, then drowned. Villages vanished. Thousands were pulled into black water that carried fire, debris, entire neighborhoods. Fury made liquid. The ocean didn't retreat. It advanced, it conquered, it claimed. And in the ruins, the silent menace of Fukushima stirred, reactors hissing, leaking poison into air and sea as if the land itself had turned traitor. It wasn't just an earthquake. It wasn't just a tsunami. It was the planet reminding humanity that the ground we worship as solid is nothing more than a fragile raft on restless tectonic rage. What if it happens again, only stronger, deeper, closer? Writing ID equals 40933, variant equals, standard title equals, the restless Pacific Ring of Fire. The Pacific does not sleep. It coils around Japan like a predator, a vast ring of volcanoes and fault lines that geologists call the Pacific Ring of Fire. From Alaska to Chile, from Indonesia to New Zealand, the ring is a belt of catastrophe. And within that belt, Japan stands at its very heart. A nation carved by collisions beneath the sea, a country pressed against forces that grind and rupture without warning. Every city, every temple, every field of rice sits on ground that shifts, bends, and breaks in rhythms older than history itself. The Japanese archipelago is born of subduction. To the east, the Pacific Plate, moving at nearly 10 centimeters a year, plunges beneath the Okhotsk Plate, part of the vast North American plate system. That descent is not smooth. The oceanic slab drags, locks, and holds until pressure builds so immense it can fracture mountains and churn the sea into walls of death. When it slips, the shock is carried outward in violent waves that ripple across the earth. Japan is the meeting point of forces too vast for human comprehension. Here, the ground itself is unstable memory, forever rewritten. Records from as early as the 8th and 9th centuries show the truth of this fragility. In the year 869, during the Jogan era, a massive earthquake struck off the coast of Sanriku. Ancient chronicles, the Neon Sandai Jitsuroku, describe its aftermath. A tsunami roared inland, drowning the plains near Sendai, submerging villages, sweeping away fields. Researchers studying sediment layers centuries later found unmistakable deposits of sand far inland, confirmation that this was no myth. It was one of the earliest recorded megathrust earthquakes on the Japanese coast. Entire communities vanished, leaving only faint words in chronicles and a silence in the soil. The centuries that followed did not bring safety. On June 15, 1896, the Sanriku coast once again bore the brunt of tectonic fury. That evening, a magnitude 7.6 earthquake shook the seabed. On land, the tremors caused little damage, and many assumed the danger had passed. Then, 35 minutes later, the ocean rose without mercy. The tsunami reached heights of nearly 38 meters in some places, obliterating coastal towns. More than 22,000 lives were lost in a matter of hours. Wooden houses splintered, fishing fleets were torn from their moorings, and survivors described the sea as if it had become a wall, moving faster than a man could run. This was not a single isolated tragedy. It was a pattern carved into Japan's history. Again and again, the coast has been reshaped by seismic wrath. In 1933, another Sanriku tsunami struck, this time triggered by an offshore magnitude 8.4 earthquake. Over 3,000 perished, despite a heightened awareness from the catastrophe of 1896. The waves rose, once more reclaiming land from the people who dared to build upon it. To live on Japan's coast was to gamble against inevitability. The science of plate tectonics, only fully understood in the 20th century, explains what generations of Japanese already knew through bitter experience. The earth beneath their feet was never secure. The Pacific Plate subducts beneath not just the Okhotsk Plate, but also the Philippine Sea Plate to the south, creating a chaotic intersection of forces. The island arc itself is the scar of millions of years of such collisions. Volcanic chains like Fuji, Asama, and Sakurajima are the visible scars of this battle. Their eruptions reminders that the surface tension of Japan's landscape is always temporary. And yet, people rebuilt. They fished the Sanriku coast again, planted rice on the Sendai plain again, raised temples on ground that carried the memory of drowning. They studied past events, creating some of the most detailed tsunami records in the world. Stone markers centuries old can still be found in coastal villages, carved with warnings. Do not build your homes below this point. They stand as messages across time, telling the living that the ocean's calm is only borrowed. Some heeded the warnings. Many did not. Japan's cultural memory has long absorbed the knowledge that disaster is cyclical. Poems, folktales, and shrines carry echoes of events where earth and sea turned against humanity. The shattering quakes of 1707, known as the Hoi earthquake, linked with the eruption of Mount Fuji. The Nenkai Trough just to the south has produced repeated earthquakes over centuries. 1707, 1854, 1946, each of them reshaping coasts, sinking towns, and sending waves across the Pacific. What if it happens again today? What if the next rupture tears not only through fishing villages, but through megacities, through industrial hubs, through nuclear plants standing on the edge of fault lines? Geography has forced Japan into an uneasy pact with catastrophe. It built one of the world's most advanced seismic monitoring systems, engineered skyscrapers to sway rather than fall, trained children to crawl beneath desks when the sirens sound. But every advance is a response to memory. Every wall and sensor is built upon the graves of those lost in past quakes. And the cycle has never stopped. To understand Japan's present vulnerability, one must trace this geography backward through time. The archipelago is the product of destruction. The forces that created its mountains and its coasts are the same that flatten its towns and drown its people. Every earthquake is not just a sudden event. It is a reminder of the ceaseless subduction pulling the Pacific Plate downward, a reminder that no amount of human will can silence the crust beneath the ocean. The Ring of Fire holds Japan in a vice. From the trenches of the Pacific to the mountain arcs that slice across Honshu, the energy builds relentlessly. The Jogan disaster in 869 was not a distant, isolated past. It was the same mechanism that tore the coast apart in 1896, in 1933, and again in 2011. Each event is connected, each rupture part of a chain that stretches across centuries. The land shifts, the sea advances, and the people rebuild, all under the shadow of forces that never rest. What if it happens again, not in a distant fishing town, but in Tokyo Bay, in Osaka, in Nagoya? What if the Ring of Fire decides to write its next chapter not in the remote Sanriku coast, but in the heart of Japan's largest cities? The Pacific Plate moves forward every second. The pressure mounts in silence. Somewhere beneath the ocean floor, the fault locks again, waiting for the moment when centuries of force will break free. And when it does, history will not repeat. It will escalate. : Writing ID equals 4093 for variant equals standard title equals March 11th, 2011. The earth trembles. At 1446 local time on March 11th, 2011, the earth beneath the Pacific Ocean tore apart. Off the Oshika Peninsula in Miyagi Prefecture, a rupture line nearly 500 kilometers long gave way as the Pacific Plate thrust violently beneath the Okhotsk Plate. The magnitude reached 9.0, an almost unimaginable release of energy, the strongest earthquake ever recorded in Japan, and the fourth most powerful in the world since modern instruments began keeping record in 1900. In that single instant, centuries of tension locked within the crust snapped, and the shock rippled outward with a force equivalent to hundreds of millions of tons of TNT detonating beneath the sea. Across Honshu, the ground convulsed. skyscrapers in Tokyo, 373 kilometers away, began to sway like reeds in a storm. Office workers clutched desks, alarms blared, lights swung in endless arcs. Trains screeched to a halt as seismic sensors automatically cut power. In Sendai, closer to the epicenter, streets heaved, buildings shook from their foundations, and the first fractures opened across the asphalt. The tremor lasted an eternity, 6 relentless minutes, where the land itself seemed to liquefy under human feet. Those who lived through it later spoke of the sheer length of the shaking as the most terrifying part. In most earthquakes, the world returns to stillness in under a minute. On that afternoon, stillness refused to come. Japan's early warning system, one of the most advanced in the world, reacted in seconds. More than 1,000 seismometers scattered across the archipelago detected the rupture, transmitting signals that triggered sirens and alerts on mobile phones. Automated announcements in schools and offices warned of incoming strong shaking. Trains on the Shinkansen high-speed lines braked automatically, minimizing derailments. Yet even the fastest system could not outrun a quake of this scale. The shaking had already spread before many could process the warnings. The rupture zone lay about 130 kilometers east of Sendai at a depth of 32 kilometers beneath the seafloor. There, the Pacific Plate lurched beneath the overriding Okhotsk Plate with a displacement that in places exceeded 50 meters, the largest fault slip ever recorded by instruments. That violent shift lifted parts of the seabed, dropped others, and shifted the main island of Honshu itself 2.4 meters eastward. In less than 10 minutes, Japan's geography was altered. GPS stations across the country captured the movement in real time, the land itself slipping under the silent command of tectonics. The quake unleashed ground accelerations that exceeded building codes in some areas. In Kurihara, Miyagi Prefecture, seismographs recorded accelerations over 2.99 G, 3 times the force of gravity, some of the strongest ever measured in an earthquake. Buildings designed to sway rather than collapse absorbed the punishment, steel bending but holding. Still, tens of thousands of structures suffered damage, ceilings crashed, and in older wooden houses, entire walls collapsed inward. The earth roared not only beneath cities, but also along coastlines, where harbors cracked and fishing boats slammed against piers. The sensation traveled outward in waves across the planet. In Beijing, buildings trembled. In Hawaii, seismographs shook. Within hours, seismic waves had circled the globe multiple times, recorded by instruments as far away as South America. The 9.0 magnitude quake was so immense it shifted Earth's axis by several centimeters and shortened the length of a day by microseconds. Human instruments registered what human bodies felt. This was not only a national disaster, but a planetary one. In the moments after the initial rupture, Japan's resilience was tested. Hospitals switched to backup generators. Airports shut down as runways cracked. In Tokyo, more than 4 million people were stranded as trains and subways stopped entirely. Mobile networks jammed as millions tried to contact loved ones. Highways closed, leaving endless lines of cars frozen in place. The Japan Meteorological Agency issued tsunami warnings within 3 minutes of the quake. Coastal communities heard sirens, some still under the paralyzing sway of the earth itself, now warned that the sea would follow. In Kamaishi, in Miyako, in Kesennuma, announcements blared urging residents to flee to higher ground. Yet even as warnings spread, the scale of what was coming exceeded calculations. The agency initially forecast waves up to 6 meters high. The true waves, generated by the violent uplift of the seabed, would reach more than 40 meters in certain coastal inlets. Inside skyscrapers in Tokyo, people watched with disbelief as massive towers bent rhythmically yet refused to collapse. The capital skyline remained standing because decades of engineering had anticipated this moment. In contrast, older coastal towns faced the disaster with fewer defenses. Wooden homes rattled apart. Power poles snapped. The shaking caused landslides in northern Japan, blocking roads and isolating villages. Reservoirs cracked, and in Fukushima Prefecture, the Fujinuma Dam failed, unleashing floods that swept away homes and claimed lives even before the ocean arrived. The human experience of those minutes is inseparable from the data. More than 120 aftershocks of magnitude 6.0 or greater followed in the hours and days after the main shock, each one a fresh reminder that the rupture had not finished releasing its fury. In the first 24 hours, a 7.9 aftershock struck, powerful enough on its own to devastate cities under other circumstances. But here it was reduced to a footnote, overshadowed by the immensity of the main quake. What if it had happened beneath Tokyo Bay instead of offshore Miyagi? What if the 6 minutes of shaking had struck directly beneath 37 million people, rather than hundreds of kilometers away? These are the questions that linger every time tectonic plates grind against one another beneath Japan. On March 11th, the epicenter spared the capital from collapse, but the length and force ensured no part of Honshu escaped untouched. Those 6 minutes rewrote everything. They rewrote maps, shifted coastlines, destroyed towns. But above all, they reminded Japan that the Pacific Ring of Fire answers to no human boundary. The tremor of March 11, 2011, was not simply the most powerful quake in the country's modern history. It was the culmination of centuries of seismic memory, a moment when the Earth reclaimed its dominance, reminding all who stood upon it that land itself is temporary, borrowed, never owned. Writing ID equals 40935 variant equals standard title equals the tsunami unleashed. When the Pacific seafloor convulsed on March 11, 2011, it was not only the land that shifted. A section of the ocean bed hundreds of kilometers long heaved upward, while other sections collapsed downward. In that violent displacement lay the birth of catastrophe. Billions of tons of seawater were forced upward in an instant, displacing the ocean above it and creating waves of unimaginable scale. A tsunami had been born not from the wind or tides, but from the wrenching of the earth itself. At first, the surface offered little warning. To those on shore, the sea did not immediately surge. The physics of a tsunami are silent and invisible in their first moments. Waves stretching across hundreds of kilometers at speeds exceeding 700 kilometers per hour. In the open Pacific, the swells were barely noticeable, no higher than a meter or two. But as they rushed toward Japan's northeastern coast, the shallow continental shelf transformed them into walls. Their height grew, their speed slowed, their energy compressed into a churning force that would erase entire landscapes. Within 30 minutes of the earthquake, the first waves reached the coast of Iwate, Miyagi, and Fukushima prefectures. In some narrow inlets of Sanriku, where geography funneled the water into higher surges, the tsunami climbed to staggering heights, over 40 meters in the town of Miyako. Whole fishing fleets were tossed inland like children's toys. Concrete breakwaters, designed and built over decades, were overtopped in seconds. The ocean did not stop at the shoreline. It advanced without hesitation, swallowing rice fields, highways, airports, and entire towns. Sendai, a modern city with a population of over 1 million, became a symbol of the tsunami's reach. At Sendai Airport, located just a kilometer from the coast, surveillance footage captured the moment the black waters surged across the tarmac. Planes, cars, and terminal buildings were engulfed. The runway transformed into a river. Passengers and staff fled to the upper floors, powerless as the sea claimed the ground below. The airport became an island, surrounded by an inland ocean that had not existed minutes before. Along the coast, smaller towns fared far worse. In Rikuzen Takeda, once a thriving city of 23,000, nearly the entire urban area was obliterated. Of its thousands of buildings, almost all were destroyed. Survivors would later speak of a single pine tree left standing on the shoreline, a solitary reminder in a forest otherwise swept away. Kesanuma burned as the tsunami carried oil from ruptured tanks, igniting fires atop the floodwaters themselves. Kamaishi Afinado, Anagawa, all names etched into the history of loss as the sea advanced far inland, in some areas up to 10 kilometers, erasing the boundary between land and water. The scale of destruction was staggering not only in modern terms, but also when measured against centuries of Japanese memory. The Samarkand coast, long vulnerable to tsunamis, had endured the catastrophe of June 15, 1896, when waves reached 38 meters and killed more than 22,000 people. Again in 1933, a massive tsunami struck, claiming more than 3,000 lives. But the 2011 waves exceeded them both in their geographic extent and in their reach into heavily populated urban centers. The 869 Jogan earthquake and tsunami, recorded in ancient chronicles, had once inundated the Sendai Plain, leaving sand deposits kilometers inland. For centuries, it was remembered in fragments of text and sediment, a warning from the past. In 2011, the Jogan memory became reality once more, as water surged over the same fields, reclaiming the same land, reminding the present of an ancient cycle that had never ended. Entire communities vanished in minutes. The town of Minamisamarku saw nearly half its population swept away. Survivors climbed to rooftops and hilltops, watching helplessly as neighbors, homes, schools, and hospitals disappeared beneath the torrent. In Affinado, the port was obliterated. Fishing boats were hurled through city streets. The sea reached where it had never reached before, overwhelming seawalls that had been constructed after earlier disasters. No structure, no defense, no plan was equal to the force released that afternoon. The waves did not come once and retreat. They arrived in successive surges, some higher than the first, battering coastlines for hours. People who thought the danger had passed were caught by later waves. Cars filled with families attempting to escape were overtaken on roads, engulfed by a tide that outran engines. Helicopter footage captured entire neighborhoods breaking apart, houses floating like rafts until they splintered in the current. The flood carried with it every object of human life: cars, lumber, electrical poles, even ships the size of factories. The power of the tsunami was not confined to Japan. Across the Pacific, warnings were issued. In Hawaii, California, and Chile, harbors braced for surges, some of which damaged boats and coastal infrastructure thousands of kilometers away. Yet the devastation abroad was minor compared to what Japan endured. Nowhere else did the waves arrive with such lethal scale, because nowhere else stood so close to the rupture itself. The scientific record confirms the enormity of the event. In Miyako, Iwate Prefecture, water levels rose to 37.9 meters above sea level. In Affinado, waves measuring 23.6 meters were recorded. In Sendai, the water surged 4 kilometers inland, transforming farmland into sea. Nearly 500 square kilometers of land were flooded, an area larger than some entire nations. The inundation maps produced afterward show vast swaths of northeastern Honshu painted in blue, where human settlements had been replaced by ocean. What if the waves had reached even farther south, striking Tokyo Bay with that same force? What if instead of rice fields and fishing villages, the tsunami had surged into the world's most densely populated urban corridor? These questions linger, fueled by the knowledge that Japan's coast remained tied to the same seismic forces, the same subduction zones, the same restless ocean that has rewritten its history again and again. The memory of past tsunamis had never vanished from Japan, but 2011 gave it a new dimension. The centuries-old warnings etched into stone markers telling villagers not to build homes below certain points were proven again, yet many modern communities had grown closer to the coast, confident in seawalls, evacuation drills, and technology. Those defenses fell in minutes. The lesson of 2011 was not that the past was forgotten. It was that the past had never ceased to be relevant. On March 11th, the Pacific did not simply rise. It advanced with the weight of history behind it, carrying the memory of the Jogan flood, the Samarkand tragedies, and countless unnamed events before them. The tsunami of 2011 was not unprecedented in origin, but in its scale, reach, and impact it stood apart. The most devastating in Japan's modern history, a reminder written in water that the boundary between land and sea has never been fixed, only borrowed, always waiting to be reclaimed. Writing ID equals for 0936, variant equals standard, title equals coastline redrawn, island shifted. The earthquake of March 11, 2011, did not merely shake the ground and unleash a tsunami. It shifted the face of the planet itself. In the span of minutes, the geography of Japan changed permanently and measurably. The island of Honshu, home to more than 100 million people, lurched 2.4 meters eastward. This was not an estimate whispered after the fact, but a movement recorded in real time by one of the most advanced GPS monitoring networks on Earth. More than 1,200 continuous GPS stations across Japan traced the island's drift, their instruments capturing with surgical precision the instant when a nation moved. The rupture zone stretched nearly 500 kilometers along the seafloor east of the Oshika Peninsula. In that immense fracture, the Pacific Plate drove beneath the Okhotsk Plate, forcing sections of seabed upward by as much as 6 meters, while other areas dropped by several meters. These vertical displacements of the ocean floor not only created the tsunami, but also rewrote the shape of coastlines. Harbors once opening to the sea were shallower. Reefs emerged where none had existed before, and some stretches of land sank, permanently inundated by saltwater. The boundary between land and ocean was redrawn in a matter of minutes. Entire coastal plains subsided. In parts of Miyagi Prefecture, the ground dropped by over a meter. This subsidence meant that areas once safe from high tides were suddenly below sea level. Seawater intruded farther inland, and long after the tsunami receded, tides continued to flood neighborhoods that had never before touched the sea. Roads, rice fields, and forests became brackish marshlands, forcing communities to confront the realization that their land was no longer the same land they had known. Other places rose instead of sinking. The seabed east of Tōhoku was thrust upward with such violence that new landforms appeared overnight. Rocky stretches of seabed, once hidden beneath the waves, surfaced into the air. Local fishermen in Oshika and Inagawa reported reefs breaking through the sea where they had never cast nets before. In some locations, beaches extended suddenly, the tide lines permanently altered. The ocean had redrawn its boundary not with gradual erosion, but in a single violent event. Satellite images before and after March 11th confirmed the changes with stark clarity. Japan's Geospatial Information Authority mapped the displacement and found that large portions of the northeast had shifted eastward, while coastal outlines had transformed. NASA satellites measured the redistribution of mass on Earth, detecting shifts so powerful that the planet's axis moved by approximately 10 centimeters. The length of a day shortened by 1.8 microseconds. It was not only Japan that changed, the entire planet bore the scar. The Oshika Peninsula, closest to the rupture, experienced some of the most dramatic movements. It shifted eastward by more than 5 meters and sank more than a meter. Aerial surveys revealed harbors and fishing ports submerged, piers that had once stood above the tide now permanently underwater. Concrete tetrapods, built to break waves, lay scattered and misplaced. Town planners who returned to measure the coast found maps outdated overnight. What once was land was now sea. What once was coastline was now lost beneath salt water. Historical analysis shows that such transformations are not without precedent in Japan's seismic past, but never before had they been recorded with such precision. In the 1707 Hoi earthquake, parts of Shikoku and Kii Peninsula experienced permanent uplift. The 1896 Sanriku earthquake reshaped inlets, though documentation then was fragmentary. The 2011 event, however, occurred in an era of satellites and geodetic monitoring, producing an unparalleled scientific record of how a megathrust quake redraws geography in real time. What if a shift of this scale had occurred closer to Tokyo Bay, where millions live pressed against the shoreline? What if Honshu had moved not east, but fractured in multiple directions? The March 2011 earthquake revealed the fragility of maps themselves, reminding the modern world that cartography is never final, always subject to the Earth's next movement. The impact of land subsidence extended into daily life. In Ishinomaki, Miyagi Prefecture, neighborhoods that had once stood on firm ground were permanently below sea level. Tides now reach into streets that had been dry for generations. Reconstruction required raising land by pumping in soil and constructing embankments. Yet the original geography had already been erased. In contrast, parts of the Oshika Peninsula that uplifted exposed rocky tidal flats. Fishermen's docks, built to reach the sea, now stood meters away from the water, rendering them useless until rebuilt. The event provided geologists with critical data. The fault slip along the plate boundary was extraordinary, reaching up to 50 meters in certain sections, the largest ever recorded in a subduction zone earthquake. This colossal movement explains not only the tsunami, but also the profound reshaping of land. Such displacement exceeded anything modeled in Japan's hazard assessments, which had anticipated significant but smaller ruptures along the Japan Trench. The scale of the shift forced scientists to reconsider the maximum size of earthquakes possible in this region. Japan's infrastructure reflected the transformation. Rail lines along the coast no longer aligned with their foundations, bridges tilted where the land had sunk, and drainage systems designed for a different topography failed to function. Airports, ports, and highways required complete reevaluation because the geography they had been built upon was no longer the same. Engineers faced the paradox of rebuilding not upon damaged ground, but upon ground that had literally changed location. The Earth's shift was recorded not only horizontally, but vertically. Coastal GPS stations showed subsidence of 0.5 to 1.2 meters in much of the Tōhoku region. Offshore sensors confirmed uplift of 3 to 6 meters in the rupture zone. Ocean bottom cables and instruments deployed later mapped the altered seafloor, finding cliffs and scarps where once there had been smooth sediment. The seabed east of Tōhoku now bore the marks of the violent thrust, like scars across the ocean floor. Japan's physical identity was altered in ways both visible and hidden. A farmer in Miyagi might find his rice fields salted forever by seawater where land had sunk. A fisherman in Oshika might find his docks stranded above new tidal flats where the seabed had risen. A surveyor in Tokyo might note his GPS instruments reading coordinates shifted meters from the day before. The nation itself had moved eastward toward the Pacific, pulled by tectonic violence. What if happens again, but greater? What if the Nankai Trough, to the south, ruptures with similar force, shifting not only a region, but the entire archipelago? The 2011 quake proved that islands are not fixed, that coastlines are not guaranteed. In that afternoon, maps became outdated, geography became fluid, and Japan's very shape was rewritten by the Earth itself. : Writing ID equals 4096 for variant equals, standard, tidal equals, human cost, and urban ruin. On March 11, 2011, at 2:46 p.m., the Earth shifted and the sea followed with merciless precision. By the time the water receded, more than 18,000 people were dead or missing. Entire families were erased, communities shredded, cities that had stood for centuries reduced to silence. Hundreds of thousands were forced from their homes, not by choice, but by the brutal hand of geography rewritten in a single afternoon. Rikuzen Takeda in Iwate Prefecture became the name synonymous with obliteration. A city of 23,000 residents was almost annihilated. 90% of its buildings were destroyed or washed away. Of the 80,000 trees that had once formed the city's iconic pine forest along the coast, only one survived, later called the Miracle Pine, standing as both a monument and a reminder of how close the city came to ceasing to exist. The tsunami reached heights of 13 to 15 meters here, surging across streets, ripping away schools, hospitals, and fire stations. Survivors clung to rooftops, to fragments of floating debris, to whatever had not yet been pulled into the sea. Along the Sanriku coast, fishing villages that had survived centuries of storms were undone in a matter of minutes. Kesennuma burned as the tsunami carried oil from ruptured storage tanks into the city, igniting flames that spread across the flooded landscape. Boats, cars, and entire houses drifted in fire on the surface of the water. For those trapped between flames and flood, survival became a question of seconds. In Ishinomaki, the largest city in Miyagi Prefecture, more than 3,000 people died, including many children who had been unable to evacuate in time. Classrooms became tombs, as schools situated near the shoreline were overwhelmed before rescue was possible. The human toll stretched across prefectures: Miyagi, Iwate, Fukushima. Families combed through rubble days later, searching not for homes. They knew those were gone, but for photographs, keepsakes, names to anchor memory against the tide of loss. In some towns, survivors were left with only lists of the missing. In others, entire registers of residents were lost, leaving the true scale of death permanently uncertain. The displacement of people was unprecedented in post-war Japan. More than 450,000 were forced into evacuation centers in the immediate aftermath. Gymnasiums, schools, and community halls became temporary homes, lined with cardboard partitions. Food was scarce, heat often absent in the bitter March cold. Medical facilities overflowed with the injured, while the elderly, many pulled from flooded nursing homes, faced days without necessary care. The sheer scale of human dislocation turned the disaster into a humanitarian crisis, as severe as the physical destruction itself. Social geography mattered in the scale of devastation. Fishing villages built directly on the shoreline were swept almost entirely away. Farming towns inland, dependent on rice paddies, found their fields salted and ruined, their livelihoods erased along with their homes. Industrial hubs along the coast, steel plants, chemical facilities, oil depots, were drowned, their machinery corroded, their storage tanks ruptured, their workers scattered or dead. The tsunami did not discriminate, but the geography of where people lived determined who survived and who did not. The voices of survivors capture the raw edge of the catastrophe. In Minimus Sanraku, where nearly half the town's population perished or disappeared, the town's disaster response center became a stage of tragedy. Workers, including the public announcer Kyoko Sato, broadcast evacuation warnings until the wave engulfed the building itself. Their final words, recorded on radio systems, carried urgency until they were cut off by the surge. The building was left as a twisted steel skeleton, a relic of the moment when human warning collided with unstoppable force. Rescue efforts began immediately but faced insurmountable challenges. Roads were torn apart, bridges gone, airports submerged. Helicopters hovered over a drowned landscape, plucking survivors from rooftops. Naval vessels patrolled waters filled with debris and bodies, searching for life in the wreckage. Yet the scale of destruction meant that many communities were unreachable for days. Some survivors huddled without food or clean water, burning scraps of debris to keep warm, waiting for relief that could not arrive until rubble was cleared. In Inagawa, a town in Miyagi Prefecture, the tsunami reached 15 meters, overwhelming seawalls designed for far smaller waves. Residents who had evacuated to higher ground watched their town vanish beneath them. Rows of houses collapsed in seconds, entire neighborhoods unrecognizable within minutes. Survivors described a silence afterward that was worse than the roar, the absence of all familiar sound, replaced by nothing but the lapping of water where a town had been. The disaster also fractured social fabric. Families were split apart during evacuation, with some never reunited. Elderly survivors, dependent on relatives, were left alone in shelters. Communities accustomed to cohesion were scattered across prefectures, some never returning to their original homes due to the Fukushima nuclear crisis that followed. Generations of connection to the land and sea were severed in an afternoon. Historical comparisons only underline the uniqueness of 2011. The 1896 Sanraku tsunami had killed more than 22,000, but in villages then, populations were smaller, infrastructure less developed. The 1933 Sanraku earthquake had left more than 1,500 dead. Yet the 2011 disaster struck in a modern industrial nation, one armed with seawalls, warning systems, and decades of preparedness. Even so, the scale of death and displacement rivaled the worst disasters in Japanese history. It was proof that no defense was absolute against the forces released on that day. What if it happens again, but closer to Tokyo, where 37 million live in the world's largest urban area? What if evacuation routes fail in a city where congestion itself can be fatal? The human cost of 2011 forces the question of how a society so advanced could still find itself stripped to such vulnerability in ours. The answer lies in the geography of risk, the unyielding exposure of a nation built along the edges of the sea. Each number, 18,000 dead or missing for 150,000 displaced, is not a statistic, but a life, a family, a town hollowed out. Entire generations were marked by loss. Coastal Japan carries the scars not only in rebuilt streets, but in the absences that remain. Streets once full of neighbors are now empty fields, their silence louder than the waves that erase them. Those who survived carry the memory as testimony, proof of the fragility of existence when the ocean turns against the land. : writing ID equals for 0986, variant equals, standard title equals, the Fukushima nuclear crisis. On March 11, 2011, as the tsunami thundered across Japan's northeastern coast, its force did not stop with towns and fishing ports. It surged into the very heart of modern power. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Okuma, Fukushima Prefecture. Built in the 1970s, the plant stood on the shoreline, its 6 boiling water reactors aligned against the Pacific. Its seawalls were calculated for waves no higher than 5.7 meters. What came that afternoon exceeded 14 meters. The ocean poured in with unstoppable weight, overwhelming defenses that had been trusted for decades. The earthquake had already knocked out external power lines. Diesel backup generators, meant to be the safeguard against total collapse, were housed in basements vulnerable to flooding. When the tsunami struck, the seawater submerged them, silencing the last protection against catastrophe. Within hours, reactors 1, 2, and 3 lost cooling functions. Without water circulation, heat inside the reactor cores rose uncontrollably. Fuel rods, normally submerged in coolant, were left exposed, their zirconium cladding reacting with steam, generating explosive hydrogen. At 1541, the first reports of total station blackout reached operators. Within the control rooms, emergency lights dimmed. Instruments went dark. The very systems designed to manage a crisis became blind. Workers improvised, carrying flashlights, using car batteries to power critical equipment, struggling to keep up with a disaster that was advancing faster than any plan could contain. On March 12 at 1536, a hydrogen explosion tore through the upper part of Reactor 1's building. The blast shattered walls and released radioactive material into the air. Television cameras captured the plume, a mushroom-shaped symbol of failure in a country that had lived under the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world watched as Japan's nuclear promise cracked open. On March 14th, Reactor 3 exploded. 2 days later, Reactor 2 suffered catastrophic damage, releasing massive radiation into the environment. Reactor 4, though offline at the time of the earthquake, burned after hydrogen seeped into its structure. 4 of the 6 reactors at Fukushima Daiichi were crippled in less than a week. The land around the plant became toxic ground. Cesium-137, iodine-131, strontium-90, radioisotopes invisible yet lethal, settled over fields and towns. Entire villages within a 20-kilometer radius were evacuated. More than 150,000 people displaced in the weeks that followed. Farmers abandoned livestock. Families left heirlooms behind. Homes stood intact yet unlivable, poisoned not by water or fire, but by contamination that could linger for decades. Radiation maps redrew safe and forbidden zones, dividing communities with invisible lines. The geography of Fukushima amplified the crisis. Built on the coast for access to seawater as coolant, the plant was exposed to the very force that destroyed it. Engineers had calculated risks, but their models underestimated the Pacific's capacity for violence. The seawall was a barrier designed for past tsunamis, not for the one unleashed by the 2011 earthquake. The generators, vital for cooling, were stationed at ground level, where floodwater could drown them. The plant's location, meant for efficiency and access, became its undoing. Japan's nuclear vulnerability had been debated for decades. Situated in the Pacific Ring of Fire, the country was one of the most seismically active places on Earth. Yet by 2011, nuclear power provided nearly 30% of its electricity. Plants dotted the coastline, placed close to water for safety and design, but each one exposed to seismic and oceanic threats. The Fukushima disaster forced the world to confront a question long whispered. What if nuclear energy, in the wrong geography, becomes not salvation but ruin? International shock was immediate. The International Atomic Energy Agency raised the accident to level 7 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the same category as Chernobyl in 1986. Helicopters poured water over burning reactors. Fire trucks blasted hoses toward shattered buildings. Workers in protective suits, later called the Fukushima 50, stayed behind in lethal radiation to prevent further collapse. Their struggle was broadcast globally, a reminder of human endurance against technological failure. Contamination flowed into the Pacific. Radioactive water, pumped in desperate attempts to cool reactor cores, leaked into the ocean. Fishermen saw their seas turned into caution zones. Markets worldwide hesitated at the word Fukushima, stamped on produce and catch. Soil across the region was stripped and buried, entire forests cut down, yet cesium lingered in rivers and groundwater. No wall, no containment dome could erase what had been unleashed. The memory of past nuclear scars sharpened the crisis. For Japan, the only nation to have endured atomic bombings, the sight of radioactive plumes felt like history repeating, though from its own hand. Hiroshima in 1945, Nagasaki days later, had marked Japan with the horror of radiation. Fukushima revived that shadow, not from war, but from miscalculation of nature's scale. Global awareness shifted overnight. Nations reassessed nuclear policies. Germany accelerated its phase-out of nuclear plants. The United States re-examined coastal facilities. Countries from Italy to Switzerland put projects on hold. The Pacific Ring of Fire, stretching from Chile to Alaska to Southeast Asia, became a map not just of seismic activity, but of nuclear risk zones. The vulnerability was no longer theoretical. It had a name, a place, a date, March 11, 2011. In the aftermath, evacuation zones became ghost towns. Streets remained lined with untouched cars, shops frozen in time, clocks stopped at the moment of the tsunami. Radiation monitors stood at town entrances, blinking numbers into silence. Families debated whether they could ever return. Children who had fled at age 10 grew up elsewhere, their birthplace closed to them by contamination levels still unsafe years later. Reconstruction was not just about bricks and steel, but about trust in land, in food, in air. The Fukushima disaster was not a single explosion, not a single failure, but a chain reaction of geography, design, and underestimated force. The Pacific Ocean had rewritten maps, but here it had also rewritten the boundary between human control and natural inevitability. The ground trembled, the sea surged, and the machines built to harness energy turned against their makers, leaving a scar that could not be measured only in sieverts or kilometers, but in the memory of a nation marked once more by radiation. : writing ID equals, for 1010, variant equals, standard title equals, rebuilding on shifting ground. In the aftermath of March 11, 2011, Japan stood in a landscape both familiar and unrecognizable. Cities were flattened, ports gutted, farmland drowned beneath salt, and entire stretches of coastline erased. Yet what followed was not only mourning, but one of the largest reconstruction efforts in modern history, a struggle to rebuild on land that had shifted beneath people's feet. The challenge was not only to restore what had been lost, but to decide whether rebuilding in the same places was even possible, or if retreat to higher ground was the only way to survive the future. Coastal defenses became the first line of debate and action. Before 2011, Japan already had thousands of kilometers of seawalls, many built after the 1960 Chilean tsunami that crossed the Pacific to strike its shores. Yet those walls, often between 5 and 10 meters in height, had been shredded by waves that in some locations exceeded 14 meters. The new vision was monumental. Seawalls in Miyagi and Iwate prefectures were rebuilt to 12, 14, even 15 meters high, reinforced with concrete. stretching like artificial cliffs between sea and land. Breakwaters were extended offshore, their foundations sunk deeper, their crests raised higher. In Affinado Bay, engineers constructed one of the world's largest breakwaters, a project costing billions, meant to blunt the Pacific's fury before it reached the town. Supporters saw them as essential shields. Critics called them gray scars, severing the ocean from the communities that had always lived in rhythm with it. Town relocations reshaped the social geography of Tōhoku. Communities that had existed for centuries along harbors and estuaries were moved inland or uphill. In Rikuzen Takeda, where almost the entire city center was washed away, engineers embarked on a radical land-raising project. Hills were excavated, their soil transported by conveyor belts to fill the flattened city center, raising it by over 10 meters. The process consumed years and vast resources, but the result was a town rebuilt on an artificial plateau above the reach of future tsunamis. In Inagawa, reconstruction plans shifted neighborhoods to higher slopes, leaving former town centers as memorial parks. Across coastal prefectures, maps were rewritten not by water this time, but by bulldozers and planners, carving a geography of resilience into landscapes that had once betrayed their residents. Yet debate raged. Should communities return at all to such exposed ground? For fishing villages, relocation risked severing lifelines. Proximity to the sea had been the foundation of their survival for generations. Moving uphill meant longer journeys to harbors, weakening economies already shattered by the tsunami. For farmers, saltwater contamination of paddies made retreat tempting. But abandoning fertile plains also meant abandoning centuries of agricultural history. The reconstruction process became not only physical but philosophical, a struggle between memory and survival, tradition and safety. Engineering responses went beyond walls and relocation. Ports were reshaped, rebuilt with wider quays, reinforced docks, and redesigned layouts to minimize damage in future disasters. In Sendai, the airport that had been swallowed by seawater reopened in 2012. Its runways raised and drainage improved, a symbol of recovery and a case study in resilience. Transportation lines were rerouted or elevated. The JR East Railways rebuilt tracks along higher corridors where possible, while highways were reconstructed with tsunami-resistant embankments. In some areas, tunnels and bridges were redesigned to endure stronger quakes, acknowledging the dual threats of seismic motion and oceanic surges. Land-raising projects became one of the most ambitious undertakings. In Ishinomaki, low-lying areas were elevated by several meters, entire neighborhoods built on artificial hills. The process involved moving millions of cubic meters of earth, a scale of transformation rivaling natural changes of the coastline. Civil engineers treated the disaster not only as destruction, but as an opportunity to reimagine landscapes, constructing artificial topographies designed for survival. Ports that had once been overwhelmed were reshaped with elevated platforms for warehouses and breakwaters with multi-layered defense systems. Community-based evacuation plans, vertical evacuation centers, tall reinforced buildings meant to withstand waves, were constructed in vulnerable towns. Evacuation routes were redesigned, with signage placed to guide residents even when power failed. Schools, where too many children had perished, were equipped with stricter evacuation protocols, ensuring faster movement to higher ground. The psychological geography of Japan shifted as well. For decades, preparedness had been defined by drills and seawalls, but the 2011 catastrophe forced a recognition that no wall could be absolute. Planning now included the possibility of retreat, the acceptance that some areas could not be defended against forces of such scale. Urban planners incorporated hazard maps into reconstruction. Zoning laws restricted rebuilding in red zones, and coastal forests, once destroyed, were replanted as natural buffers alongside man-made walls. International observers studied Japan's reconstruction as a model and a warning. The debate over seawalls resonated in countries from Chile to Indonesia, each facing its own seismic coasts. The land-raising projects in Tōhoku became case studies in post-disaster engineering, demonstrating the immense costs and complexities of rebuilding not just homes, but entire landscapes. Japan's reconstruction revealed both the potential of human resilience and the limitations of even the most advanced planning against the unpredictability of Earth and ocean. By 2016, 5 years after the tsunami, some towns had been reborn, their streets filled again with homes, shops, and schools. Others remained skeletal, their reconstruction slowed by debates over relocation, funding, or demographic decline. The contrast between places that rose quickly and those still waiting reflected deeper truths about regional inequality and the burden of rebuilding in aging rural communities. For some survivors, reconstruction meant renewal. For others, it meant exile, the permanent loss of place. Every seawall, every raised block of land, every relocated neighborhood carries within it the memory of March 11th. Maps of Tōhoku today bear the imprint of both destruction and engineering. Coastlines edged with barriers higher than ever before, towns perched on artificial ground. Yet beneath the new geography lies the knowledge that the Pacific Ring of Fire still trembles, that tectonic plates still grind beneath the sea. What if it happens again, larger than 2011, higher than 15 meters, stronger than any seawall? Reconstruction has bought time, but it has not ended the dialogue between land and sea. Japan's rebuilding stands as both achievement and warning, a testament to endurance carved into shifting ground. Writing ID equals, for 1011 variant equals, standard title equals, legacy of a shattered coast. On March 11, 2011, the Earth itself gave scientists one of the most dramatic lessons in tectonic power. The magnitude 9.0 Tōhoku earthquake ruptured along the subduction zone where the Pacific Plate dives beneath the Okhotsk microplate, shifting the seafloor by as much as 50 meters in some places. The shock did not merely rattle the ground, it permanently moved Honshu, Japan's largest island, by about 2.4 meters eastward and dropped parts of the northeastern coastline by nearly a meter. For geophysicists, it was not just destruction but revelation, a moment when decades of theory met brutal reality. Satellites tracked the movement, GPS stations recorded the displacement, and seismometers captured aftershocks that would continue for years. The disaster became a living laboratory, a reference point for every future discussion of tectonics, tsunami modeling, and seismic risk. Tsunami science transformed in its wake. Until 2011, models underestimated the possibility of such enormous waves along Japan's Pacific coast. The Sendai Plain had experienced smaller tsunamis in 1896 and 1933, but the 2011 walls of water, reaching heights of over 40 meters in some narrow bays, rewrote assumptions. Ocean buoys deployed across the Pacific detected the waves, but the sheer scale revealed gaps in early warning algorithms. Researchers expanded simulations to consider maximum credible events, incorporating longer rupture zones and multiple fault segments. The 2011 disaster forced global systems to accept what had been considered almost unthinkable, that earthquakes at the upper limit of magnitude are not rare outliers, but real possibilities that must be planned for. Japan became the epicenter of a global network of observation. More than 1,200 GPS stations across the country recorded how the archipelago shifted during and after the quake. The GeoNet system revealed a slow post-seismic creep, with land still adjusting years later as strain redistributed beneath the crust. The Japan Meteorological Agency upgraded tsunami warning protocols to issue faster, more flexible alerts, even when data was incomplete, to avoid the deadly underestimation of wave heights that occurred on March 11th. Research vessels mapped the seafloor off Tōhoku, discovering giant fault scarps and submarine landslides triggered by the quake, phenomena that had amplified the tsunami's height. What once was theory became measured reality, every dataset carrying the weight of lost towns and drowned farmlands. But beyond the science, the memory of 2011 pressed itself into Japan's cultural lineage. This was not the first time the nation had been rewritten by seismic catastrophe. The 1707 Hoi earthquake, estimated magnitude 8.6, struck southern Honshu, collapsing villages and triggering an eruption of Mount Fuji. The 1896 Sanraku tsunami, with waves over 38 meters, annihilated fishing villages, killing more than 22,000 people. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 reduced Tokyo and Yokohama to rubble, firestorms killing over 100,000. Each event carved scars into history, shaping architecture, literature, and memory. The 2011 catastrophe joined this lineage, the latest reminder of a truth Japan has known for centuries. The ground is never permanent, the sea never fully tamed. Communities carried forward the memory not just in monuments, but in daily life. Stone tablets, some centuries old, had once warned, "Do not build below this point," standing forgotten until the 2011 tsunami proved them tragically right. In places where survivors rebuilt, new markers were erected, evacuation routes signposted, drills institutionalized. The event became a generational dividing line, shaping how children were taught geography and history, how families recounted their survival, how urban planners redrew maps. The catastrophe was not left behind. It became part of a landscape of memory, embedded in the very way people looked at the sea. The geographical reflection was unavoidable. A single rupture, lasting barely 6 minutes, altered maps permanently. Coastlines sank, estuaries reshaped, wetlands created where neighborhoods once stood. The Oshika Peninsula, closest to the epicenter, shifted eastward more than 5 meters. Ports that had been built with precision engineering were reconfigured by nature in moments. Their breakwaters crumpled like toys. The disaster forced a recognition of geography's raw power, a reminder that land is never fixed. Human borders, property lines, and city grids can be erased by one convulsion of tectonic plates. For a nation whose existence is bound to the ring of fire, this truth is not theoretical, it is lived. The long-term lessons extended across the globe. Chile's 2010 mall earthquake, magnitude 8.8, had already challenged assumptions. But the Japanese disaster gave scientists more data than any quake before. Seafloor pressure gauges, GPS stations, satellites, and tide gauges recorded it with unmatched precision. International collaborations expanded, linking Pacific nations in shared monitoring. The United States adjusted its tsunami models for the Cascadia subduction zone, where a quake of similar magnitude is expected in the future. Indonesia revisited preparedness after the 2004 Indian Ocean disaster, now with Japan's 2011 experience as a cautionary parallel. Each nation looked at Japan and asked, what if it happens here, today, with our cities, our coastlines? Yet in Japan, resilience became not only an academic subject, but a national identity. Reconstruction was not uniform, nor was it easy. Some towns rose behind 15-meter seawalls. Others retreated to higher ground. Ports reopened with reinforced docks. Railways rerouted to safer elevations. But beyond concrete and engineering, resilience was visible in the lives that carried forward, in the families that rebuilt businesses, in schools where children rehearsed evacuation drills, in the cultural insistence that no disaster, however vast, would erase the will to remain. The legacy of the shattered coast is therefore not only geological or scientific. It is written in memory, in planning, in the acknowledgement that the earth and sea are not adversaries to be conquered, but forces to be lived with. Every new tsunami drill, every evacuation map, every raised seawall is part of this inheritance. The people of Tōhoku live with landscapes altered forever, their homes shifted meters from where they once were, their harbors reshaped, their histories carried into the next generation. The ground will move again, that is certain. Tectonic plates will lock and strain, and one day they will rupture once more. What if it happens in Tokyo Bay or off Hokkaido, or in the Nankai Trough where seismologists predict another great quake? The 2011 disaster has already answered the question of possibility. It can happen, and it will. The only uncertainty is when. And when it does, the lessons of 2011, scientific, cultural, and geographical, will stand as the foundation upon which Japan continues to rebuild its life upon shifting Earth.